Hello everyone, this is the Raven's Librarian, and I'll be discussing episode 6 of the One Piece live action adaptation. Mostly just giving my general thoughts and impressions of how they adapted the anime and the manga, trying to keep discussions of things that happen later in both to a zero as much as possible. I'm just talking about how this episode compares to what occurs in the other versions, and just general vague personal impressions of, things that stood out to me. If you're interested in that, welcome, and if not, sorry for wasting your time. So in this episode, we focus mainly on Zorro's recovery from his fight with Mihawk, and on the establishing of Sanji's character for the rest of the journey, the new member of Straw Hats the Cook. Starting with the Zorro thing, I want to retract a previous comment I was making in the past episode. This is something that you can definitely notice. It's something I think sometimes people can get, myself included, can get very stuck on minute things in one episode, in one story, in a contained narrative, and not really give it the storyline time to flesh out stuff. So yeah, instead of rambling, what I mean is the part with, in the past episode, I commented that I felt like the story could have delved more into Luffy's personal reaction to what was going on with Zorro and the fight with Mihawk. So I retract that, because in this episode, that was the idea. They wanted to give more time in this episode to actually flesh out what this situation meant for him. You can argue that this one focuses much more on that than on the other stuff, but I still think that that's an important thing to acknowledge. That's like, I ran on about that in the previous episode, then watched this one, and suddenly it's like, oh hey, turns out they were thinking of that, they just were saving it for later. They just wanted to have more of an episode dedicated to it. So, like I said, it's just, that's something I felt I needed to acknowledge. I do think they do a good job of focusing on that, showing the dynamic with the group and how they all cope with what's going on with Zorro. So yeah, I think they did a good job of giving Luffy the proper reaction. He takes this a lot more, the whole situation with what happened to Zorro and how that reflects on him as a captain. There's a lot of focus on that in this episode, which is an interesting choice. This is something that comes up in the other stories, but it comes up a bit later. Not gonna talk about when because of spoilers, but it is something that instead they seem to want to tackle more head on now. Maybe as a need to give this version of Luffy more to invest for the audience than just, he's a much more, I don't know what the right term for it would be, but he's a much more straightforward character in the other versions, and I think that's just a matter of how they want to portray the main character in the story. It's something that not every story does, and not every story likes to have a very stoic kind of, straightforward is the wrong word, but it's just the way it's, the idea is that certain characters have certain drives and arcs. So point of the story is they learn, grow, and develop as the story continues. The Luffy from the other stories doesn't really do that, because he doesn't really have to. That's not the point of his character in the other stories. So it could just be that they wanted to give him more to do in this version. There's the inclusion with, not the inclusion, the new stuff with Mihawk and the interaction with Garp is probably some of the most fun parts in this version, especially because it gives an interesting dynamic that we don't see in the other versions. I like Mihawk's overall I don't care attitude without coming off too arrogant. Like, it's interesting to see. This is definitely going to be one of those fun, how would this happen in the other storyline for fans of the series. So we got the encounter with Mihawk. The stuff with Garp, I'd say I'm kind of so-and-so on that. I'm waiting to see how that pays off in the last episodes. So for now, it's more important because of how it feeds into Kobe's character, less than what I think it's actually meant to do for the old man. Because so far he's an interesting character, but he comes off as just the old man that's upset at his grandkid for running off and being a pirate. There's the cool part where they have him absolutely wreck his own room in a weird twist where he's both mad but laughing, and even the subtitles describe it as laughing maniacally. It's always kind of on the nose when the subtitles kind of, try to convey tone, but I know that's kind of necessary for, obviously, people who may have trouble hearing, which will probably be me in a few years. Anyway, then the focus on the episode is the stuff with Sanji and the stuff with Arlong. So I'm going to start with the Sanji stuff, because that's from the original versions. So Sanji, basically they kept his flashback story to almost exactly to the other version. I say the only thing that mattered from the other versions that they didn't have or didn't pay much attention to. In the other version, he has a much more stigma with the other chefs in the boat that he worked on about not wanting to eat food that was quote unquote in low quality. There was a thing where he made good food. Some of the people in the boat wouldn't eat all the food, and so the other chefs would eat the leftover stuff. And Sanji in the other versions, Sanji makes a bit of a stink about that, about that's classless, that's something that a true chef shouldn't do. And then of course when he winds up stranded with Seth in that rock island, exactly like how it looks in the other versions too. But yeah, when he winds up there, obviously eventually the poor kid's starvation and stuff kicks in, and it's messed up not even karma, it's just messed up situation where it's before he wouldn't even think about eating food that was actually good, but just not meant to be eaten because it was leftover. Now he's being forced to eat food that's actually going bad, but if he doesn't eat it at all, he's gonna die. So obviously all the main characters have some tragedy in their backstory, but you can this is where, even in the other version, this is where clearly the creator starts amping up the more on your face tragedy of the backstories. Goes from, again, to it's all gonna be debatable. That's a common thing. Fans debate all the time which Straw Hat has the most tragic backstory. I'm not gonna get into that. Anyway, Sanji's backstory nailed it. Nice touch with Seth is because live action, so he has the exact same hairstyle, at least the mustache, that his outer counterparts have. But because these are actual pieces of hair in his face, the actor has to talk, and so these things refuse to stand still. It's something dumb, but it's just something I couldn't help but notice as he's talking, especially when he's very passionate and yelling. The things start flopping in his mouth because they're part of his face. It's just, I only noticed it because in all other versions, those things are just solid objects, even in the animation, which doesn't really have that excuse. They could animate it to do it, but they don't have to. So instead, he'll just talk, and outside of the slight movement of his mouth, those things just stick. So it's just something funny. Again, I don't want to rail on that because what the heck were they gonna do? Not have it? That'd be dumb. So there's that part. The dynamic between him and Sanji, it's really good. I like that they kept the way that they mess with each other. They come off as very rude, very crass, but there's clearly a lot of care there. There's always the point of just reading between Seth's lines when he's giving Sanji a hard time. The whole point, he says it up front in this episode, but if you read between the lines in the previous episode, it's obvious that he's trying to get Sanji to move on, and it's something that they have him just get out and say it finally in this version, where it's in the previous ones he has to convey that by other characters. That's a thing where again, maybe intentionally different, and we'll see how that plays out. But in the previous version, Luffy's the one that kind of has to get it through Sanji's head that this is what Seth wants, is for him to leave. He does eventually figure it out, and he also Seth does kind of say it directly to him later. Oh, apologies for that. Sorry about that, my dog saw a bug. So it's the interaction between Seth and Sanji matches the versions, like they're rude, crude with each other, but there's clearly care there. It's not just, crude for the sake of it. It's just the way they are, but it still conveys what they feel about each other. Like that they kept the farewell scene, but I'll get to that later. The encounter with Arlong. So this is the stuff that's new, stuff that they changed, same with the Garp stuff. And so in this version, having Arlong here changes the way that this ends up, changes the encounters. This is a different version of how Luffy meets Arlong for the first time. It's a different version of how we're introduced to him, the way we're introduced to him. It sets up the Fishman stuff a lot earlier than the other versions. Won't get too much into it, again, because that would be too much into spoilers, but hopefully it won't be too much to say that in the other versions, the dynamic between humans and fishmen isn't what in the beginning. You wouldn't see it the way you do in this version, where Arlong kind of says it directly, where you get the specious racial bias that is meant to be inferred in this version. Because in the other versions, we get it all from Arlong's perspective, but Arlong doesn't actually verbalize it the way he does here. In this version, he outright states the stuff about how most fishermen want to get along with humans and be treated equally, but he thinks that's an insult. Now, that's not really getting into everything about his character, but it doesn't have to, because that's not the point. Like, he's the bad guy. But what's funny is that in the other versions, he doesn't even give us that much. Like, instead, in the other versions, he focuses entirely on fishmen are better, end of conversation. It's not a defense argument. My point is that he doesn't establish, for the audience's sake, that he's coming from the perspective of someone that's been persecuted from being a fisherman. He doesn't establish that fishermen are generally treated differently, and so he's reacting against that in his way. In the original version, you'd be, easy to most people would just assume that he's coming at this from a purely advantageous standpoint, that he recognizes that fishmen are biologically superior to humans, and he's just rolling with that because why not? It's meant to be like, you don't know in the originals where he's coming from, where his motive is. So that's something that completely changes the way you might look at him. At least I would assume it would have a change in that. Whether or not they're going to change his overall personality, I somehow doubt. But it changes the subtext to his interactions. And I'm assuming that is intentional. In the line of things that are intentional, there's his gang when he shows up with two other fishermen. There's one fisherman that might be missing from there. We'll see in the future episodes if they have that one there. And if not, there might be a reason for that. But we'll get into that in the next episode. In this one, it's focusing on just the ones that are there. I won't really speak to their... Oh, hold on, I'll try to get through all this before... Sorry, I don't know how much anyone actually wants to see what I'm doing in the gameplay. I'm just using it for, background. So, the encounter with the fishmen. Can't speak to their makeup. Somebody who's a better expert at, how to do that stuff can hopefully judge it. It looks fine. Obviously, it's not going to look as convincing as it can in other mediums, but it looks close enough to what the other versions have that I definitely am not going to take points off for inaccuracies. They're doing the best they can. There is one funny line which I don't know if it's a response to any of the online feedback to when the trailers were coming out. I imagine these scenes were filmed way ahead, but like I said, I don't know how far in they were anticipating the reactions. Because it's the line when Luffy and Arlong first meet, and Arlong does the casual, like, I'd imagine someone bigger, and then Luffy just goes with the very quick comeback, like, yeah, so did I, honestly. And it's a very on-your-face, immediate joke. The only reason I bring it up is because one of the people I watch who was anticipating the live action made a comment. I don't know if that's his actual, if he goes by the name, but it's the Grand Line Review guy. And he made the comment of how Arlong isn't as big as he is in the original, which is true. But it's like, so it's, again, I don't know if that's something the creators of the show wrote in, knowing people were gonna bring up, or if it's just what else are they gonna make fun of? His nose, that might come off, wrong. Same way that, when Luffy, like, says I don't bow to any man or fish, just the, like, because of his personality, I genuinely believe that Luffy has no malice behind it. He genuinely just thinks, oh, wait, you're not a human. Maybe you're a fish? Do I call you fish? Like, it's a really dumb detail, but it's one that's obviously gonna come off, might come off way worse if we take the fish is another species way of calling them, too literally, and we take Luffy's comments a bit too serious. It's when we're different when, like, in the actual, I think, anime, possibly the manga too, like, Sanji and Zorro will make that comment. In their case, I would actually take it as okay, now they're just being offensive for the sake of it. But, again, Zorro and Sanji are kind of intentionally written to be a bit of a jackass, so that checks. Looking forward to when the two of them talk. That's gonna be fun, at least for me. Maybe not for everybody else. The actual fight was real cool. Funny when Sanji enters fights, the music kicks in. Also, actually, whenever he's around and the story and camera are focusing on him, it looks like the soundtrack comes with him when he walks into the boat and it plays his song. I just bring it up because I don't think I noticed that happening with any of the other characters, so it'd be really funny if that was done specifically for him. Like, oh no, yeah, he needs, whenever Sanji gets involved, you need to play the soundtrack. Now I'm confused. So in the actual fight is, before the fight, the really messed up but I love addition that they brought, the buggy head. It is both, it makes Buggy, like, he's a walking head now, talking head. It's just, there is so much potential with this that I'm honestly amazed it took this part for us to get to here. But I also loved it when he includes the whole, I knew he was he was setting it up way in advance from like a mile away when he kept saying, I have ears everywhere. And I can't recall for the life of me if they actually showed that he has an ear missing in any of the other scenes when he says that. But I knew, the moment he said it, I knew. It's like he put his ear into something, didn't he? Like, that's what's going on, right? Like, he put his ear and somehow, like, managed to get his ear somewhere else. But the fact that he put it on the hat is really creepy. And also raises questions of like, hey Luffy, all those times that you were like checking the hat, you never noticed the ear. Like, you could argue that's a plot hole, but I also just take it as, no, Luffy really is just that oblivious. But more just, I was expecting it when Buggy meant the whole, he hear thing. I was wondering what kind of cheap joke they were gonna take from that. I appreciate that they only went with the, that got boring real fast thing when he's like, hearing them all the time, and it's like, you guys have no idea what you're doing. This is gonna take way longer than I remember. So in the encounter between them is really fun, and the fact that they kept ahead by the end is even better, because that means we're gonna have more encounters, more interactions with Buggy and the rest of the crew. So it's going to be real fun to see how he, for lack of a better word, bounces off of the other Straw Hats. And how this is going to keep stacking things into the rest of the episode. Like, how this will pay off. I wonder where the rest of his body is. I'm imagining it's back where they left it, but it would be probably for the sake of convenience. Arlong probably took the rest of his body parts to the island, wherever he is. So they're probably gonna, that's gonna be Buggy's like motivation to actually help. It's like, hey, you want the rest of your body, right? He's also taking this surprisingly well, considering he's just a, running head. But he does make a point of like, no, don't put me back in the bag, and it's wet and sandy and dark. It's like, haha, funny. The poor guy's, probably going insane in there, assuming he's not already crazy. Did I actually grab that? Yeah. Sorry, brain farted. There's, trying to see if I forget anything too important. Like I said in the other video, this is like very rambly. Hopefully I keep putting these in the description. I do not want to waste people's time with, tangents. But just trying to recall any other bit. Oh, the special effects when Luffy punches Arlong look pretty decent. Nothing too but actually when they actually bother to like show him throwing punches, I was worried they were only gonna limit themselves to like maybe 1, 2, and then just immediately fall into, close-up fights. They still do that for the most part, but they have actual, like, special effects into the fight. And obviously, this is just the first bout. They're definitely saving bigger things for, like, the finale. We'll see how that goes. There's also a lack of other fights in this part. And, like, Sanji gets a little bit and then immediately gets taken out. So hopefully in the next fights, these characters will get cooler fights. Also, Usopp, he's missing out on any of the big fights. It makes sense, but he does need to do something. So I'm still waiting to see, like, some part for him to, like, show off his slingshot skills. I guess sniping would still be the right term for him. So we have... Okay, sorry, gotta pause, make sure I don't ramble. I think the only other aspect I'm forgetting is there's a reference in a previous episode where they mentioned that they're going to Garp when he's like discussing how to fix the ship in the last episode before he calls Mihawk. They mention a marine base. I don't recall numbers, but just I'm guessing that marine base is probably gonna play a part in the next part. The one thing that did strike as I was trying to recall things was the scene where Nami is reading the book for Zorro as he's sleeping, because they told everyone to like just keep talking, is to keep him, try to get him mentally engaged. The inclusion of that book is gonna be a fun reference for those who know where the story goes past this point. So that's a nice touch, because it doesn't like take away from anything if you don't know what it's doing, what it's referencing. And it's a nice spot to put it, honestly. So it'd be interesting to see if it ever gets called back to. The other being, I guess, just the way that certain Straw Hats interact with each other, how they interact with Zorro in that situation. There's an interesting detail that I don't know if it's just meant to be due to his personality or a reference to how he is mentally like stressed in this episode, but it's the part where Luffy is having trouble just thinking of stuff to say, where it's like he's not very good with the imagination part or the direct storytelling part, but it pays off when he just upfront gives that emotional like moment. I love the the exuberance and happiness he has when he realizes Zoro's okay, and he just starts screaming and right in his face. But also it pays off also with Zoro's way of just straight selling his new commitment to this dynamic. That's always an important touch that it kind of is unspoken for beyond the scene he does with Mihawk. The fact that this whole being a pirate with Luffy thing was just kind of, he had nothing better to do. situation in the other until now. So it is an important aspect of showing that their dynamic is changing as the story continues. And it'll be fun to see how it translates into their conversations in the rest of the episodes that are left to follow. But yeah, I think I'm really just going to keep circling back if I don't stop here. I'd say good episode, not maybe as impactful for me as the previous episode. I might still think it's still, and I definitely think, although there's more cool stuff in these two parts, I think the previous two-parter with Usopp and Kuro was the stronger. We'll see how that compares to the next two parts with Arlong and Nami, but I'll save that for the next one. Hope. Thanks for listening. If any chance any of you have seen the previous episodes that I've done and this one, if you noticed any big difference in the audio, please let me know. I'm doing a bit of testing with a new mic, and I'd like to get some feedback if it's not too much of a bother. Thanks for listening, and hope to see you in the future once. Take care, everyone.